One of the most terrifying and brutal torture methods used throughout history was the oubliette. Many of these can be found inside of medieval castles, and these are dungeons and cells in which prisoners are left inside of, and are left to rot and die. It was an execution, and was a death sentence, as when someone was placed inside the oubliette, there was no way they would get out. Often inside the oubliette, further cruelty could be added with spikes in the bottom of the dungeon, which would cause further pain, and the remains of the person who perished before in the oubliette would still be there. But the Nazis during the Second World War saw the oubliette in dungeons, and they decided to bring in this form of torture and punishment to the concentration camps to inflict immense suffering onto the inmates. Join us today to look at the torture of the oubliettes of the concentration camps, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Oubliettes in their most primitive senses were dungeons, which were small and tight spaces. For example, at Warwick Castle, the oubliette there is a hole in the basement of a prison, in which a prisoner could lie down and could not stand up. Inside here, rats would literally eat someone alive, as they were starved and left for dead. This dungeon in particular was so feared that during the 100 Years' War, the French captured prisoners heard of its reputation. There was also an oubliette in the Tower of London, where prisoners such as Guy Fawkes were held, and this was a tiny room built into the side of a wall, where prisoners were forced to crouch all day and night and could not stand up. There was a terrifying psychological element of the oubliette, but the Nazis during the Second World War would implement this style of torture to the concentration camps. The standing cell or Stellbunker was used by the Nazis, and also the Soviets, who referred to them as a Kisha. There were many different standing cells and oubliettes found inside of the concentration camps within Hitler's Germany. At Oranienburg concentration camp in 1933, before the war had broken out, the SA camp commandant Werner Schaefer had 2 standing cells built into the basement of the punishment block, and these specific cells were so small that a prisoner could only stand. They were forced to stand for long periods of time. This was used on an inmate known as Newman, who was held inside the standing cell for 192 hours, and he was driven insane by his imprisonment there. The prisoners of Oranienburg were also held inside of coffin-sized closets, where they could stand only also, and this form of punishment was used there. But after the war had come to an end, there were many accounts given by former prisoners held inside tiny cells such as oubliettes or the Stellbunker, and a number gave evidence as to how their ordeals were inside of these dungeons. There were also standing cells found at Auschwitz, and the guards of the largest concentration camp would administer the punishment for prisoners, and who had offended the decisions of the camp commandant Rudolf Höss, and he would decide how long someone would stay inside of the standing cell. If a prisoner had committed a serious offence, then they could be held there for a number of weeks, and even up to 6 weeks inside of the cell. Some inmates were kept inside the cell for asking for more food as they were starving. But some inmates who picked fruit from the trees that grew around the camp were also placed in the cell. Sometimes for first offences, people were held for 3 days, but then it could be weeks depending on how serious it was. At Auschwitz, the guards would use a 1-yard square cell, and these were found inside the torture block. The prisoners were forced inside these, and some were held for up to 20 nights. They were then only released during the day to complete work. They got no break at all, and the cells only had a 2-inch hole for air to come into, meaning that a prisoner could hardly breathe. Sometimes more than one inmate was held inside of the cell, making conditions even worse, and it was purposely made so that an inmate could not sit down or get any respite. One survivor of Auschwitz, Josef Karl, stated that he was held inside the standing prisons for 6 weeks, and during this time he was only given 3 meals, and when he was released he was starving to death. He claimed that he even once saw one of his fellow prisoners eat their shoes as they were so desperate. Rudolf Höss, a commandant of Auschwitz, would later claim that the punishment inside the standing cells was only limited to 3 nights at a time. However, through the testimony of witnesses, we know that this was wrong. It was administered inside of Block 11 at the camp, the torture centre, and it was close by where prisoners were executed up against the death wall, the firing range where thousands lost their lives. Dachau concentration camp was a site which was also closely associated with torture and the mass suffering of inmates. Guards here inflicted severe punishment onto the prisoners, and the camp opened on the 22nd of March 1933, and it was originally planned to house political prisoners. But thousands of people were sent to Dachau and its 100 subcamps, but the guards in all the sites were incredibly violent and brutal. In public, floggings and whippings took place, and it was said of one incident that 2 prisoners who had stolen a cigarette were sentenced to 25 lashes, each of the whip. 2 prisoners were led forward by their block leader. 2 block leaders carried out the punishment. 1 prisoner uttered no sound. The other prisoner behaved differently, crying out at the very first stroke. When the man began to scream, I went hot and cold all over. Even the beating of the first prisoner made me shudder. Each day during roll call, the prisoners were forced to wait for hours, and the harsh punishment continued. If someone had died in the night, their body was dragged into the roll call yard. They were then included in the barrack numbers. But the standing cells were part of the fear of Dachau, and this was used to punish inmates for a variety of rule breaks. They were placed inside the Sperrbunker for many different reasons, and in the cells of Dachau there was a small hatch on top of the cell for air, and there was a narrow door with an iron bar which was bolted across, securing the inmate in. The cells at Dachau were the type which only housed 1 prisoner. This Oubliette-style room measured 30 inches by 31 inches across, and this was like being stuck inside of a chimney for days on end, and weeks on end. 1 prisoner of war held in the cells at Dachau said, "It was a terrible state, as I thought it was over for me. Everything was so callous and distant for me. I could not lie down, couldn't crouch. The best to do was stand 6 days and 6 nights long. You touch the walls on both sides with your elbows, your back touches the wall behind you, your knee the wall in front of you. This is no punishment for pre-trial detention, it is torture. Straightforward Middle Ages torture. I had bloodshot eyes, numb from bad air. I was waiting for the end." The entrance to the cells of Dachau was very small, and someone was forced to crawl into the site, and the door was around 2 feet square, and it was made from wood. Behind the door was metal bars, and the prisoner had to get on their hands and knees to crawl into the cell, and then stand up. Once they were stood up, there was no room for them to move, and they were locked in the position standing up. Their back would be pressed against the wall, and their knees would be touching the wall in front, and their elbows were wedged to the side walls. But they were then kept inside this position at Dachau for 72 hours, and at this time a prisoner would have to sleep standing up. And they were sometimes fed measly rations of bread and water, but most of the time they were not fed at all. This was similar to an oubliette, as inmates were systematically starved to death, and sometimes the Nazi guards and a commandant would make the decision to use the cells as an execution method, and people were condemned to die and were never given a chance to come out after they were starving. Some prisoners were brought out to conduct 10 hours of hard labour before they were thrown back in. Some prisoners were also at Dachau not given any water, and when they were let out to do hard labour, they would tell the other inmates of their torture. One prisoner who was held inside the standing cells at Dachau was Johannes Neuhausler, who was held inside them for 3 days. During this he was given one single scrap of bread, and on the 4th day he was taken from the Sperrbunker, and he was allowed to sleep on a wooden cot-style bed. Following this he was then locked back inside the bunker to spend another 3 days. A Czech prisoner was forced to spend 8 days inside the cell at Dachau, and sometimes inmates were given a break to allow the guards to hose the cells down, as they would urinate and defecate in the cell. This could obviously cause disease and further problems inside the torture block. Yurij Piskunov was another man held inside the standing prison. He was arrested by the Gestapo, suspected of sabotaging German trains, but then inside of Dachau he found a German newspaper. He tried to take this into the camp, as news from the outside of the camp was valuable to the inmates. But this was discovered, and he was locked in the standing cells, and he recalled, "It was dark wherever I turned. I immediately came up against a wall. I could only sit a little by leaning my back against one of the walls, and with my knee against the opposite wall. I was very frightened and did not know if I would live the next morning. It was damp and cold in the cell. This is how a day would pass. They began to mock me. When the food was brought, the SS officer forced me to bark or grunt like a dog, on all fours, and scolded me, a filthy Russian pig. He always had his whip ready. If something did not please him, then he would whip me immediately. All I could do was turn to the Almighty, so that he could take my soul and save it from these torments." He was held for 10 days inside, and was brutalised by his ordeal. The following day after his release he spat blood, and even caught TB, but did manage to survive the war. The Nazis inside the concentration camps utilised medieval-style torture devices and methods, which had been used centuries before by torturers to inflict pain and suffering. The oubliettes were a horrific torture method, which had to be one of the worst in history, as someone was left to rot and die. It had a huge psychological effect, and because of this, the prisoners were driven mad. Imagine being locked inside a tiny chimney-sized space where you could not move and had to spend all day stood up. It would be hell. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.